In this presentation, we'll be going over our plans for site preparation, fertilizers, forage selection, and grazing methods for the facility described in the first oral exam. So we can determine what fertilizers might need to be added and how we can adjust these for the species that we're going to be planting. And we'll be discussing about soil testing later in our fertilizer section as well. So we're gonna check the property before we put horses on it and make sure that the pastures, fence line, and the property don't have any poisonous plants that are common to the area. Some that are common to South Carolina include oak trees, which you need to keep far enough away from fence lines to keep acorns from falling in pastures, as well as maple trees, cherry trees, and then bracken ferns, hemlock are some other common ones in the South. And then clover contains the slough-ramine fungus, which can cause slobbers. So clover itself isn't toxic, but that fungus that can live on it can cause that in horses. So it can be taken care of, and it has a really mild toxicity, so a lot of people don't worry about it, and clover can have a lot of properties as a legume that can help increase the soil capacity and keep that root structure to help other plants around it grow and to reduce weeds. So one of the things we're going to do on the facility is to eliminate those fence lines that are at smaller than a 90-degree angle. So there's several that are tighter than that, and so what we would do is take that fencing that we've selected and round the corners so that there's less likelihood that a horse could get trapped in a corner or cornered by a more dominant horse. We're also going to check runoff locations for all of the pastures to ensure that we have safe runoff and it's not going to get in or contaminate any waterways, especially that pond on the property. So some maintenance that we're going to be doing as part of our site preparation. Winter maintenance, we can go through and check those fence lines. Again, if we have that wood board fencing, that's going to have a lot more maintenance than if we're able to pay for the vinyl fencing. And in the winter, we can budget and plan and save for those fertilizers, herbicides, and other pasture maintenance as we need it. We don't necessarily have the pasture space to designate specific winter pastures, but since most of the horses are going to be in stalls in poor conditions, we can use sacrifice lots for the horses that are staying out so that we can plan around that. So even if we don't have winter pastures set up, we can still try and keep the pastures better in inclement weather.
Another important aspect of pasture maintenance is to determine what types of fertilizers and herbicides should be used and when these should be applied. It is important to note that these should both be applied during the rest period when no horses are in the pasture, and also these pastures should be dragged and mowed during this time as well. Kind of to develop a strategy, the first thing you should do is a soil test. This will, one, help you determine which type of grass is best suited for growth for your soil type, and two, it will help you determine what types of fertilizers or nutrients should be added to the soil to promote optimal grass growth. So this soil test should be done every 2 to 3 years. One of the values that it gives you is for nitrogen. It's important to note that this should be applied during the spring green up, and that the value that they give you on the soil test for application should be divided into about 2 to 3 doses. Next is phosphorus and potassium. This should be applied after the first grazing of the year, so around the May or June area. And the value that they give you on the soil test is the annual application rate. So this does not need to be split into doses like the nitrogen is. Next is lime. This helps to adjust the acidity of the soil. This can be applied at any time of the year, but it does take around 6 months to adjust the soil pH. It's important to note that the value that it gives you on the soil test is for one application within the 3-year testing period. So this is not performed annually like the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are. Next, we're going to look at herbicide maintenance. So for summer weeds, generally you want to spray these in the spring because it's easier to combat when weeds are in a younger life stage instead of full blown into the reproductive stage when they're laying seeds. Next, you want to make sure you're selecting the correct herbicide for the weeds that are emerging. So a lot of pasture herbicides are kind of general for broadleaf weeds, but they also do have herbicides for specific weeds. So you just need to determine which would be best for the type of weeds that are growing in your pasture. Next, you want to make sure that you're allowing rest time with no grazing on these pastures because one, you want to reduce overgrazing. This will shorten the plant root and allow more room for weed encroachment in your soil. And two, because you want to make sure that these herbicides are being absorbed by the plants before the horses get in the pasture and graze, and it could cause sickness. Next thing for weed control, you definitely want to remember to mow regularly. This helps to replace leaves for vegetative grass growth and then stops the grass from growing to seed or the reproductive stage. And this is important because it is also less desirable and nutritious for the horse once it gets to the seed stage.
So going off that, we're going to forage selection. So going through the soil test, something we're looking for is the pounds per acre of each nutrient, as well as the soil pH level. So we decided to go with Bermuda grass. It is a grass that tends to grow really well in South Carolina, assuming that our site is in South Carolina. So this pH level that we're looking for is hopefully between 6 and 6.5. Obviously, we don't have an actual soil test to go off of, so this is just what we're hopeful for the Bermuda grass to be able to grow. Bermuda grass grows better in more acidic soil. That means a lower pH, so 6.0 to 6.5. However, we don't want it to be too acidic because then there might not be enough phosphorus for the Bermuda grass to grow. On the other hand, if the pH level is too high, then there won't be enough nutrients such as magnesium, zinc, copper, or iron for the Bermuda grass to thrive. So looking at our nutrients that levels we're looking for. So for nitrogen, we were looking for something between 0.5 and 1.0 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Obviously, that may not be the case. So if our nitrogen levels are not where they need to be, we would look at options like planting legumes. And so we talking about planting clover, which is a legume that grows decently up in South Carolina. And that would be something that would help continuously maintain the nitrogen levels. However, if we didn't want to plant legumes, then there are also other fertilizer options. So there's a water-soluble nitrogen option to spread. And again, the problem with this is you chance fertilizer burn. So to prevent that, we want to keep it at about 1 pound per 1,000 square feet. Now that does come in both granular and sprayable forms. And so depending on the equipment that you have on your farm, or depending on how you spread it. Now that takes about 7 to 10 days to activate and to start working. And then obviously you usually do nitrogen fertilizer applications 2 to 3 times, 2 to 3 different doses. And so every time you do a dose, you'll want to wait after about half an inch of rain is falling before you let your horses continue grazing on that grass. Moving back into things like limestone, which controls the acidity of your forage, for Bermuda grass, you want to keep it about 50 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So obviously, Bermuda grass is a warm season forage. So for our cold season, we talked about planting perennial ryegrass, another grass not quite as common as Bermuda in South Carolina, but it still grows and can manage. And that would just be used to outcompete the weeds during that time of cold season when the Bermuda grass isn't quite as thriving quite as well. Now, to maintain these pastures throughout the year, you're obviously going to have to keep doing a soil test to keep updated on how your soil is doing. And that'll also be a deciding factor on your levels of fertilizer you apply in lime. And those will fluctuate based on weather and how well your horses graze or don't, and how well your forage is doing. So there also may be a need for reseeding based on that as well. You also need to continue things like herbicides to control those weeds, because obviously the ryegrass is not going to completely control all the weeds on its own.
So I'm going to be talking about our grazing methods. We said that we do not have enough pasture space for continuous grazing since each horse requires an average of 2 to 4 acres. We only have 85 acres total, and not all of that is pasture space, and we have 52 horses, so therefore it's just not quite enough space to do continuous grazing. So we said that instead we were going to do rotational grazing, even in the smaller pastures, as much as we can, because any rotation is better than none. We decided to do this because there's several benefits to it, such as if a horse is on a pasture for enough time, they can meet all of their nutritional needs on that forage alone. So that can help us cut costs as far as not needing to provide them with extra supplements or extra feed. We're hoping that it will also improve the pasture. That way, when we soil test, we won't necessarily need to put so much back into it because they won't be necessarily eating down all the way to the roots and ruining the integrity of the soil. We also said that it would increase the fresh forage intake, which most horses prefer due to their own tastes and desires for food. Now, the one biggest loss to this is the fact that we are most likely going to be using temporary fencing in the different rotational areas. So that will have to be moved, and the horses will have to be moved, so it will just make for more labor. We did say that we wanted to add sacrifice areas to each pasture as much as we can so that we can maintain the integrity of those grazing areas and allow them proper rest time. So we said that each sacrifice lot will have to be able to be reached from each rotational grazing area. So we said, like, for example, this pasture is kind of a funny shape. So we said maybe we put the sacrifice lot here in the middle, kind of have it divided like this with this in the middle. and we could split different pastures on each side. And that way they can always reach the sacrifice lot, but still rotate through this pasture. We said as far as maintaining this, that we are going to try to graze each pasture for roughly 7 days with a goal of at least 21 days in between for rest so that the pastures can regrow. We know that we want to start the horses on a pasture once the grass reaches 6 to 8 inches long, and that we will be removing them once that grass is down to 3 to 4 inches. We did say that we would need to probably potentially adjust the density of the horses in each pasture, depending on the size of the rotational pastures, since some of the big pastures are kind of irregular shapes. Some of the grazing areas will be sort of funny shaped and smaller. So we said that, that density might need to be adjusted. And also just depending on how fast it takes them to graze the grass down. And then we said, once a pasture has been grazed down and we've moved the horses off of it and it's at rest, that we will need to mow, fertilize, herbicide, drag, whatever we need to do during that time period.
As a barn owner, it is critical to determine how you will develop and maintain the pastures on your property. When creating a pasture maintenance plan, it is important to consider things like preparing the sites of your pastures, determining the type of forage you would like to use and plant, implementing grazing methods that will work with the pastures you have available, and planning a fertilizer and herbicide schedule. Taking these factors into consideration when making a maintenance plan will allow for the maximum utilization of these pastures. Thank you.